and online and blended face-to-face spaces, because some of those frameworks have implications for the materials we design. Hi, Eunice. Yes, thinking about engaged student learning. Absolutely. Thank you. So 2 frameworks that we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at some sort of general concerns that always crop up around materials creation. And having looked at those, we're going to look specifically at some very interesting research that comes out of psychology around cognition. And then we're going to look at universal design for learning briefly as a particular approach to materials design. So we're going to kind of move from talking about some quite big ideas around frameworks for learning. What are we trying to achieve in our classrooms? What kinds of classroom spaces are we creating? Through to some quite detailed ideas around cognition, and then a little bit of zoom back out again to universal design as a framework for thinking about materials. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. What I should have said was I'm generally not unreasonably bad at keeping an eye on the text chat. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to jump into the text chat immediately and just ask those there. I am also very open to you simply unmuting your mic and saying hi and asking a question. I would substantially prefer that people didn't feel that they had to wait until the end of the session to ask a question, because sometimes it feels a bit, one's been stewing over it for a very long time. So I will pause every now and then and check in, but I will also ask you to please feel free at any moment to kind of jump in and ask a question, make a comment, tell me how something works or doesn't work for your context, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen. It'll take me just 1 second to get to the right place. Okay. So I promised that we would start with 2 frameworks for thinking about materials in the context of a particular learning approach or learning structure. So these frameworks by no means grab everything, okay? They're not kind of all-encompassing frameworks. They are just always partial representations of possible ways that people think about learning and teaching in online spaces. So the model that's in front of you at the moment is Julie Salmon's 5-stage model. And I want to talk specifically about these gray layers, okay? Those are your stages. And in each stage, what she talks about is she talks about the technical support that you need in that stage, i.e. the pale purple stuff. And she talks about the kind of facilitation, what she calls e-moderating, but which I think of as perhaps the more human face of it, the what are the people doing in that space question. So this model is something that you might see quite a lot in kind of postgraduate study. You might see it in the humanities. It tends to be a model where there's a very strong emphasis on interaction. It also tends to be a model where there's a strong emphasis on inducting people into practices and into ways of being, rather than a focus on knowledge per se. So I'm thinking, for example, about Jay's case. Jay, this model may have kind of PBL type affiliations, but maybe not so much kind of disciplinary courses. So I'm going to try and make links for people as we go, but I'd also love for you to sort of think a little bit about your particular context and how things may or may not work. So she offers these 5 stages. She thinks of it as a kind of access and motivation stage. So just getting people into a space, whether it's, she talks about online spaces, but I think one can think about this in a physical space as well. Just helping people to show up at the right place, at the right time, ready to go. Then she talks about online socialization as the second stage. And in that second stage, the goals are really around helping people to understand what are the practices of engagement in the space. So how do people interact with each other? What do we do to learn? What do we do to ask questions, and so on? She defines a third stage as an information exchange stage, and that stage seeks to facilitate and support the use of learning materials. So that helps students to kind of find their feet in the structure of the space. Then she talks about a knowledge phase, a knowledge construction phase, and that phase is focused on helping students through engagement to construct an understanding of something. And then finally, she talks about a development phase, which is when people will start to move out of the learning process almost. They might start to respond to things, they might start to move beyond what is encapsulated in that particular learning moment and start to think about, well, how do I take this outside into my real world, real life? Okay, so this is one of the models we're going to use as a kind of contextualizing space. The second model we're going to use is a much older model than Gilly Salmon's, and I think is a model that is often used quite commonly in subjects that have very strong um, content orientations, where we're thinking a lot about what do I want my students to learn. And it's a model that focuses on these stages in order. And it's Gagne's events of instruction, and they talk about gaining attention, informing the learner of the objective, stimulating recall of prior knowledge, presenting information, providing guidance, eliciting performance, providing feedback, assessing, and then enhancing retention and transfer. So in this model, you'll see that, I mean, aside from the fact that there are more stages, there's a kind of first block, which is really around getting a learner into a particular space. Then there's a block that's really around getting a learner to learn something and demonstrate that they have learned that thing. And then there's a kind of assessment and exiting block. So there are similarities between both of these, and they are useful ways to think about, where do my materials fit? The thing that I'm making, where do I locate it? Either in this kind of constructivist leaning model, or in a slightly more content leaning, perhaps a transfer, or some might even argue behaviorist kind of model. So I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'm going to ask people, is there anyone who's thinking my course leans more one way than the other? I'd love to hear specifically from the folks who are in a blended teaching mode, which model would be better suited. Jay, I'm going to say it's still disciplinary. I don't think that the shift to the online space necessarily changes the what of the teaching in as big a way as some people would argue. So some people would say that just because we've moved into an online space, we should be living here in the kind of Gilly Salmon 5-stage model. But I don't think that that's true specifically for things like SEM subjects. I think some of these stages will happen, but they will happen much faster. We'll kind of accelerate through those, and different things happen in this knowledge construction in particularly STEM subjects, and in some of the professional degrees. So neither of these are meant to be models that 100% represent reality. They're always going to be partial. And they're going to be elements of them that you are uncomfortable with, and elements of them that perhaps feel a little bit more comfortable, or a little bit more like they resonate for you. The key thing for me, though, that I'd like people to take away is that when you are thinking about materials design, you're not just thinking about like, what's the overall model for my course? You're also thinking about, where in the course is this happening? Okay, so that was kind of the first thing I wanted people to take away. Are there any comments or questions before we move on?
Shanali.
Jay?
Yes. I'm still
Hi.
kind of, grappling with, the two models. I mean, I
Hmm.
recall that was quite a good few years ago when I
Mm-hmm.
did the EDN. So My question to you is, Shanali, in terms of a particular lecture, a
Yeah,
disciplinary content,
yeah,
or an integrated course. So I'm just
yeah,
trying to grapple with, how do I really kind of see this gets applied? For example, in PBL, I can
yeah.
already see the first model, as you had highlighted,
Hmm.
works beautifully, but
Yeah.
it's not across the board.
No. And in if I think about the MBCHB first year, there are going to be elements that are they're going to be sessions that are PBL oriented and therefore are about like convening this learning community. And then there are kind of those content sessions like lectures that happen alongside that where people's focus is really on helping students to engage with particular content. But I think what sometimes happens in that process is that the temptation when you're doing a lecture will be to jump in here at this level
Mm.
4, 5 level, like jump straight into information. And I think where Ganya is useful, even if it is a little bit older, is that he insists on in every learning interaction, what do we do to gain people's attention? What do we do to be clear on what we're going to achieve in that session? Um, and I think those are useful things that very often, like lecturers will walk in, there'll be a greeting at the beginning of the session, and it'll be, this is what we're talking about today, and we're straight into it. So I don't think there's anything to stop you cobbling these together to think about different parts of a course. I wonder how that feels.
Thank you, Shanali.
Yeah?
I
Okay?
just need to grapple with, in terms of where do I see things fitting in for a particular discipline and a whole
Hmm.
course as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And none of them have to be true for absolutely the whole course, right? So there may
Yes.
be different experiences in the same course that kind of draw on different parts of this. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Jay. Ta.
Thanks,
Eunice, I
Shanali.
think I saw your mics slip on and then off again. I was wondering if you had something you wanted to add.
No, thanks. Thanks for all of this.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask a question that's been bugging me for a while, and it may
Go
just
for
be a
it.
stupid thing. With 30 hours of contact teaching time over postgraduate courses, for example,
Right.
I find that I often think at the end of the 30 hours, which I normally extend to something like 36,
Yeah.
but I often find myself asking the question, am I losing time when I do, for example, steps one and two?
Mm-hmm.
I often find that there's a lot more time taken up with my first 3 hour sessions. I normally have 10 by 3 hour sessions,
Yeah.
at master's level.
Yeah.
I just want to, if it's possible to think about that, even if not now.
I think
Am
it's a
I
good.
wrong in thinking that what is happening with my course design? Is there something wrong that I'm
So I
doing?
think it's a good question, and I think it depends very much on contextual stuff around it. So, in my mind, how much time we spend either in this kind of first 3 steps here or in steps 1, 2 here depend on, is this the first time I'm meeting this group of students? Am I going to see them regularly? Is that, have we developed a community shorthand? In cases where people are with you for a whole program, and so perhaps they're seeing you actually in multiple courses in the year or spread out across the year, there may be combinations of these that get more or less attention at different times. I guess the thing that I want to just highlight or emphasize, though, is that our attention often as lecturers will fall on the content of the course, the things we want to cover, the what of the course. And particularly in the online and blended spaces, there has to be a very deliberate attention paid to constituting the classroom. And materials are a part of that.
Can
Sorry.
I just
Kristen, yeah.
add, yes, as someone who is a postgraduate student in the School of Education as well, I was wondering, with a time constraint, if you could add your learning objectives into your course outline and also on your ruler page, on the lessons page, have that clearly set out so that you don't feel you have to spend time with every face-to-face or online lecture to spend like half an hour to setting the stage?
I don't
would
think you
that-
should ever spend half an hour on it in an online lecture, but I do think that putting it into, so what's interesting is how we think about spaces. The online space it depends on whether you construct the online space in your course as an absolutely critical space for engagement, or whether it feels like a second tier space. So if you're constructing your Vula page and you have a space for learning outcomes, and then you have some way for students to engage with those, to comment on those, to talk back to them, then that's a very different arrangement from a kind of here are the learning outcomes and now we're done.
So you could maybe have like a comment.
You could have a little
box under
comments
there.
box underneath it. But again, what you have to do is, because we're humans, and the digital is still less familiar to us in many ways than the physical. And so we're teaching people how to be in the digital. And if your students have a strong preference and a stronger familiarity with the physical or with the synchronous digital, then we have to make sure that we thread those two things together very carefully. So it would not, in my mind, it would continue to be dangerous to have my learning outcomes on my Vula site and have a comments box that nobody ever engages with.
Yeah. Okay. So you would recommend to still mention that in your lesson, in your.
I would recommend starting with a question around
Okay.
okay, so these were and you can literally do them really quickly. These were the learning outcomes that were set out for this week. How does that fit for people? How does it land? Does this feel like something relevant to you? It can be an activity you do at the beginning of the course where you say to people, here's a Google Doc, comment on it. We're going to talk about it in week 1 in detail. And then you kind of come back to it and thread it through. Yeah. I hope that answers the question to some extent. It's probably it's quite a cognitively heavy approach, I think, to keep going back to those things.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so very quickly, some general considerations for materials development that people will be familiar with, okay? So whenever we're thinking about our materials development, we're thinking about purpose. We're thinking about, is it a learning material? Is it an assessment material? Is it an evaluation material? We're thinking about the audience for that material. Is it us, actually? Very often our slides are for us, they're not for our students. So we have to think quite carefully about who's the audience for the material, who's getting the most use out of it. Is it going to be educators? Is it going to be learners? What would make it easier for learners, easier for educators if they're the desired audience? We're going to think about mode a little bit. So we're going to think about, is this going to be a static text? Is it going to be video, audio? Is it going to be visual in some way? Is it going to be graphic, and so on? In the contemporary context, I think that we are very accustomed to a kind of face-to-face mode, and all of these other forms of engagement take extra effort. The more time, the more layers of composing you have, like a video, for example, or a graphic, the more time and skill it takes to develop those kinds of materials. And for most of us, our skills are strongly in the kind of face-to-face realm. So those are things we're developing. As we're considering our materials development, we're probably going to want to think about the relationship between the user and the text. Is this the kind of text where the user is looking at it and going, this is the word of God from on high, and I need to simply internalize it and make it part of my life? Or is this a text that we want people to engage with critically? Is this a long-term love affair between the user and the text? Is this going to be the kind of book that sits on their bedside at night and drives them and coaxes them and moves them towards a different human being? Or is this a purely transactional interaction between the user and the text? So for every item of material that we stick in front of our learners, we should be thinking, like, what's the relationship here? And I suspect that's a question that maybe we don't always ask. And certainly in many courses where students land up with screeds of readings, for each session, the relationship between the user and the text is very complicated and sometimes very unpleasant. We want to consider in terms of our materials development whether this is a material that's independently created or collaboratively created. And one of the things that I think we should consider increasingly is how do we help our students to create materials with us? And if, as a kind of partway step to that, to have conversations around materials with us. And then in the South African context, I think that it is absolutely critical that we think about different languages. And so to think about how we can take a text that's in a relatively powerful, well, in an ultimately powerful language like English, a very powerful language like English, and think about how can we complexify that text to make space for other languages. How can we kind of create space within the text for voices in different languages to find expression? And in some cases, that's through tools like glossaries. In other cases, it's through having students do wonderful things like create versions of the text in their home languages for different kinds of audiences, or create infographics of the text in their home languages for different audiences. So to think about how we can bring people's linguistic resources into classrooms as a resource, both for the class, but also as a gift to the broader community. Okay, so those are some of the kind of general considerations for materials development. And I think the things that we should really be keeping eyes on actually is these issues of language, collaboration, and relationship. I think particularly this issue of relationship between user and text is something we don't think about enough and we don't talk about enough. Okay, so this is where we slip into the sort of science-ish of materials design. And I want to today share with you some work that I found really interesting that I've taught about in a PG Dip course for a little while. And it's work that draws on the field of perception in psychology, and that has a theory about how we need to shape materials in order to make them maximally accessible to students. So on the screen in front of you at the moment is a representation of a dual channel understanding of how people perceive input and what they do with it. So if input is delivered by image, this kind of top line over here, if it's delivered by image, the argument in this dual channel theory is obviously we see it with our eyes. There's a visual processing process that the brain undertakes, and eventually it moves from working memory into long-term memory with sufficient repetition, etc., etc. They propose that there is an alternate channel, and that is the auditory or speech channel. And somebody says something, we process it through our sense of hearing. It goes through a kind of verbal processing model or verbal processing activity in our working memories, and eventually it lands up in our long-term memory with sufficient repetition and engagement. So these two channels, the visual and the auditory, are in competition or in relationship, and they can either work competitively with each other or they can work supportively. And much of the theory that I'm going to chat about today, Mayer's principles, are based on the idea that we need to harness those two channels in a constructive and coherent way in order to produce the most useful materials for students. So some things or some principles, assumptions, if you will, that this particular work is based on is that, first of all, learning is an active process of filtering, selecting, organizing, and integrating information. So the takeaway there, learning is active. People are not just passively absorbing something. It doesn't go from your mouth to some clever little cell in my brain. There is an active, engaged process happening there that helps us to connect the things we encounter in the world with what we believe in our heads. It's also based on the idea, as I've said, that there are these two separate channels, the auditory and the visual, for processing information. There are other channels, obviously, we have other senses as well. But for now, generally for academic teaching, they talk about these two channels. And that this is an interesting part. The channels have limited or finite capacity, which we refer to as cognitive load. So on the basis of these three principles, or these three beliefs about how learning works, Mayer gives us three principles. He says that our job fundamentally, when we are making materials, is to reduce extraneous processing, i.e., get rid of the things that add unnecessary cognitive load. So if a student has to go search around in a messy resources folder in Vula, that's extraneous processing. We should do everything we can to stop that. He also says that what we have to do is we have to manage essential processing. So there are elements of the learning process that are unavoidably challenging, and we have to do what we can to manage those and perhaps to minimize the challenge. And finally, he says that on the basis of these three assumptions, what we have to do is we have to create conditions that foster generative processing. So those are the three principles that he suggests. Are there any questions before I go any further? Or any comments? Eunice, go for it. Just unmute anytime.
Shonali, thanks. One of the questions that I'm just sitting with is if we reduce extraneous processing
Yes.
per course, for example, and
Yes.
you know, I fully buy that, right? I've trimmed my Vola sites down extensively in terms of complexity.
Yeah.
Is it a valid question to ask about how we then induct students into the complexity of knowledge systems? For example, just navigating the UCT library site.
Yes.
How does, am I conflating something here, or?
No, I think we're dealing with very complex learning, right? And our students are expected to learn. Please feel free to say mic on and jump in at any time. Our students are expected to learn in our classes. They're expected to learn from each other. They're expected to go out and learn from the libraries and the big wild internet, etc. And we have to figure out which of those things we want them to learn and which of those things take up unnecessary space. So I think it's quite useful for students to learn how to use, for example, research tools in the wild, but they shouldn't have to hunt through 3,000 different resources before they figure out how the library itself works. And I think, Eunice, one of the things that perhaps we can definitely do, and I'm speaking as somebody who works at School of Ed as well, or at least whose course runs through School of Ed, I think that sometimes our program connections are not strong enough. So each course has to individually do things like worry about inducting students into academic writing activities, and individually worry about inducting students into how do you find things in the library, how do you use the internet like safely and responsibly for academic research. But perhaps those are things that we need to kind of spiral and spin through a program of courses rather than each of us individually taking those things on. Yeah, I feel like the biggest lack at the moment is academics don't have time to talk to each other anymore, and probably haven't had time to talk to each other way before the chaos of COVID and the sort of pivot to online. Those are not new problems. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Are there any other questions about this kind of these three principles? Reduce the unnecessary extra, and I'm not suggesting reduce discipline specific extra. I'm saying reduce the mess that gets in the way before that or during that. Manage the essential processing and then foster generative processing. And some of that is just a bit terminology and a bit jargony, but it can be useful as a framework. So For each of Mayer's principles, he gets really excited and he starts building more ideas. So we've got each of the 3 principles, and then each of the 3 principles kind of explodes into some other things that you can do within that kind of umbrella. So we're going to chat about each of those, and each of those has an implication for what we do on our materials. So in terms of reducing extraneous processing, he gives us 5 things. He says, make it coherent, i.e. the coherence principle. Get rid of any redundancy. So anything where things are duplicated in multiple places and potentially multiple ways, get rid of that. Signal clearly. So is there a clear structure that's signposted and signaled for your students upfront that you regularly return to? I think of this as making the filing cabinet in my head and the kind of conceptual map in my head visible to my students. He talks about spatial contiguity, which is a really horrible phrase, but what that means is put the things that are meant to be, that are like intellectually close together, put them physically close together, which is surprisingly not something that people do sometimes when they make materials. So think about locating things in space close to each other. And finally, he talks about temporal contiguity, which, as you can guess, relates to things that belong together should be close to each other in time. Okay, so 5 ways to reduce this extraneous processing. And this is true for all your different kinds or modes of material. So it's true for your LMS. It's true for a live video lecture. It's true for a recorded video lecture. It's true for a voice note, a podcast, a worksheet, an infographic. It's true for all of the above. Is anyone confused first about any of those principles? Okay, I'm hearing silence. I'm not seeing any typing. Yeah? Okay, so as we're building something, as we're making something for our students, are we thinking about how to make it easy for them to navigate that learning space? That's really the extraneous processing in a nutshell. Okay, let's move on then to this idea of essential processing. And he says with the essential processing, there are 3 ways that we can make it easier for our students to engage with materials. The first thing is to segment your materials. You would have heard this from SILT people time and time again. Cut up your videos. So if I was doing this as a recording, I would probably do it in 3 parts. And maybe each part would be one of the different principles at work. To make it more, to kind of follow that segmenting principle. He talks about the pre-training principle, and this is absolutely critical for anyone in the humanities, and possibly for anybody where there is jargon around discipline that students will be unfamiliar with. So the pre-training principle is about preparing your students to engage with a particular learning resource. One of the experiences that sticks with me from my time in the Writing Center was students saying to me, Shonali, it's a 15-page reading. I have to consult my dictionary 10 times on the first page because the jargon of it, the language of it is so unfamiliar. And so pre-training your students to engage with, for example, readings by highlighting things like key terminology, even going so far as to perhaps sometimes highlight a structure for your students in order to prepare them to engage with a particular kind of text can be absolutely critical. And then there's the modality principle, which is to say, what mode is most appropriate for the thing I'm trying to teach? Should I be using my voice? Should I be using a visual? Should I be showing my students a simulation? Should I be out in the field recording something? A little bit difficult during lockdown, I will concede, and showing them that recording. Should they be working with me simultaneously in some kind of shared writing space? So what mode are we using to support essential processing? Okay, pausing there for a second. So this is principle number 2. You have to manage essential processing. And there are three parts of it. Break things up, i.e. chunk things. Make sure your students are ready to take on what you need them to learn, the pre-training principle, and check the mode. Make sure your mode is right for what you're trying to achieve with that learning material. Any questions, any comments? I want to know if anybody feels pressure or challenge or resistance around any of these, because these are often, segmenting is something that's very difficult for us to take on board sometimes, because we think of our work in big picture ways, and breaking it up into small chunks can sometimes be very difficult once we've developed that big picture. And similarly, something like pre-training or modality can put a huge burden on academics in terms of making materials, because it means you've got to take a reading, you've got to annotate it in advance, you've got to figure out what might your students not understand for that and prep them for that in some way. And similarly with modality, you might need to learn a whole lot of tools for making things like videos or infographics or websites or whatever it is you find yourself needing to make. Are there any comments or questions there? So for some of the EdTech advisors in the room, this will be the kind of space where you might need to start asking some supportive questions around whether these things have had consideration. Okay, and then Mayer's last principle is this idea of generative processing. And he says we've got to find ways to make opportunities for generative processing to happen. And by generative processing, he means that help our students to connect with the material. And he suggests two things. Number one, he talks about personalization. So if you can personalize in any way. So for example, in Vula, there's a very simple trick where you put a student's name into double curly brackets. And instead of it just coming up, what will happen when they arrive on that page is that it will, for example, say, hi, Shanali, or hi, Nikki, or hi, Maria, rather than just launching into the page itself. We can have a look at that in a second if anyone wants to. So personalize where possible, and that could be something as simple as somebody's name. It could also be something like choosing images of people in videos, in graphics that will resonate for your students. I don't know how other people feel, but I struggle to find images of students either at high school level or at tertiary in South Africa that look like people that look like South Africans for me. I don't know why, but I feel like Americans look a particular way. And even if you've got a kind of group of Black African Americans, the picture seems to read as this is America rather than this is South Africa. So finding images, creating images, building image banks that your students can relate to is a time-consuming but very, very valuable thing to do. And perhaps one of the things that one can do within a course is you can ask students to participate in that, to share images of themselves at work, to share images of spaces and just life in general that feel relevant to the course that can be drawn into course materials. The second principle, or the second way that he suggests, is the use of voice. And that is to use human voices where possible. There's a substantial push, particularly through spaces like TikTok, spaces where, and obviously historically, through spaces where it's cheaper to have a robot voice read something than a human voice, to use robot voices. And robot voices can be quite distancing. So he says, where possible, use local voices, use local accents, use imperfect human beings that students might relate to, as opposed to distancing through sort of voices that might distance, such as robot voices or professional presenters and so on. Okay, so before we go on to UDL, that, in short, is some of Mayer's principles that are useful for us to think about when we're designing materials for our students. Are there any thoughts, any questions, any concerns? any comments that people want to make in relation to those. Are there any elements of those that feel particularly challenging or threatening or just uncomfortable?
Sinead, I have a
Thomas,
question.
hey.
Hey, in terms of sorry, spatial contiguity,
Yes.
can you give a sense what that might look like in a course?
So I'm going to sketch it verbally rather than pull up a drawing because I'm scared
Sure.
I'll get lost in my Google Drive. Let's imagine that you were, very simple example, way back in the dark ages when I did biology at school. One of the things that bio teachers insisted was that if you were labeling a diagram, that you labeled the diagram as close as possible to the aspect you were labeling. So if I was labeling a cell and the little mitochondria was tucked in the bottom left-hand corner, the label for that needed to be as close as possible to the bottom left-hand corner.
Mm.
And now this is going to sound like a really silly and basic thing, but I cannot tell you how often the label for a process is somewhere else on the slide.
Right.
Creating some confusion for students who now have to go searching across things, particularly when I think you are, when we're moving quite quickly through material, or when students have to glance at something and get a big picture image immediately. So for example, if I were to look at the screen that's in front of me right now, this is not the prettiest set of colors on the planet and it needs some revision, but all the stuff related to extraneous processing is together.
Mm.
I don't have it kind of scattered all over the screen. There are different ways to present this more attractively and possibly to pay better attention to accessibility issues. But basically your spatial contiguity says keep ideas that are related to each other visually as close as possible.
Thanks. I'm thinking maybe in terms of, say, I have a course which, for whatever reason, personal preference or skill or time, whatever, doesn't really have a lot of visual elements at all. It's very discussion focused and reading focused. Is there an aspect of spatial contiguity that also like refers to so not so much materials, but like where the materials are placed
Like
together and the links that are made up between
located in, so I would say that's kind of more temporal.
them? Okay.
So almost where are things placed in time? How are they sequenced? But I think that human brains, I mean, if you look at the way human brains are structured, we have very strong visual processing. We have strong auditory processing as well, but very, very strong visual processing. And so one of the things that I've seen lecturers do that I think is incredibly powerful is to take those temporal connections and make them visible in some kind of visual representation. Because the temporal is always fleeting. And often doesn't give students a point of reference to say, we'll have experienced something in a particular order, but some people experience it as a kind of flow of consciousness and haven't figured out what are the breaks between ideas, what are the kind of threads in the conversation. And so being able to represent the verbal in a visual way gives students an alternate channel through which to access that understanding.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
Yeah.
techniques that we've seen people use is obviously things like concept mapping, mind mapping. A really cool thing would be to ask a small group of students each week to create the visual representation for that week and get them to share that. And that kind of brings that collaborative co-creation element into the room as well. And sometimes they have technical skills that we are still working on.
Yeah.
And it distributes the work in meaningful ways, which I think is useful as well. But thank you for the question. I think it's a useful thing to think about.
Cool. Thanks, Nani.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, folks, any other questions about these principles for managing processing? All right, I'm going to move us on then, and I'm going to chat about one last thing. And I apologize for all the text on the screen. One of the themes, one of the focuses that you will have noticed happening across the SILT webinars program and across SILT itself is a focus on universal design for learning, UDL principles. UDL is an interesting perspective to think about in relation to materials, because UDL focuses, I think, primarily on what a student is doing. And so it can offer a very interesting framework to think about what are the materials that are helping my student to do something. The three things that I want you to take away is that there are these three principles. People like odd numbers. There are these three principles around universal design for learning. One is multiple means of engagement. So allowing students different ways to interact with course content, their peers, the instructor, and so on. The second principle that UDL propounds is the idea that we must allow multiple means of representation. And by that, they're talking about presenting content in different modes or formats. And this is a bit where I get itchy with them, and I don't like it particularly. They talk about allowing students to choose the formats in which they learn best. I think that sometimes allowing students to choose a format in which they think they learn best allows them to stay within a comfort zone that also keeps them out of powerful modes of engagement. And so sometimes we have to push students to engage with formats that they are not comfortable in order to help them to access more powerful modes of engagement. So it's a little bit of a, that for me is a principle that yes, I see why it's useful to have multiple means of representation. I would suggest also that there are better or worse means of representation for certain kinds of content. And finally, UDL suggests that we need multiple means of action and expression, i.e. multiple ways for students to show us what they've learned. And that can mean creating different forms of assessment. So a student might share something in an essay, they might just as well share it in a presentation or in a video recording or something like that. And I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm actually going to just pause there. I'm going to say one more thing about this slide, which is that UDL has these three things, as we've talked about: engagement, representation, action, and expression. And it's very, very focused on giving students options and choices. And those are useful things when we think about our materials. So for example, we might give students just a voice recording of something, or we might give them a voice recording and a set of notes, or we might give them a voice recording and slides, or we might just give them a video of ourselves sitting and chatting to somebody on the couch or interviewing someone on the couch. So thinking about different forms of materials in terms of what it allows students in relation to engagement, representation, and then action and expression is another sort of framework for helping us to maximize choice, which, as I said, can sometimes be a slightly dangerous thing if students are not making well-rounded choices. So I am going to, I believe, pause there. I'm going to just mention the things that we haven't talked about in detail today. So we haven't talked about Creative Commons materials at all, which is a whole field of materials design that is very much worth exploring and that we'll have sessions on moving into second semester. And we haven't talked in detail about universal design for learning because that also focuses a great deal on activities rather than materials. And we wanted to keep today fairly focused on materials. But I think that's where we're going to stop for now. And I'm just going to open up the floor for comments, questions, or ideas. I have to maybe kick us off, I have a little bit of a question, and that would be, would a checklist based on Mayer's principles with some examples be a useful thing? And if you think so, if you think the answer is yes, please pop a yes into the text chat. And if you think the answer is no, please feel free to remain silent or to say no and why. I'd be open to both those answers. So if you think that a checklist with some examples would be useful, please pop that into the text chat, and we'll endeavor to create such a thing. Yeah. Okay, I see a few yeses, maybe with a link to the principles in more detail. Yes, there are some beautiful, I mean, he has a whole book on this. and it's very strongly embedded in the perception literature. One of the reasons I like it is I think it's really strongly science-based. And I think that while we are going through a moment where we are focusing very strongly on cultures in classrooms, we must find ways to bring the sciences and the cultures together, or else we risk unlearning things that we already know. Thank you. Okay, cool. Thanks, Nikki. Take care. Have a good day. I'm pretty sure many people have to run to other sessions, so I don't want to keep you unnecessarily. I want to say thank you all for your presence and thank you for your questions and your participation. And I do just want to encourage you, if you have any questions in the last few minutes before we close the room, please feel free to just pop them into the text chat. You can also private message me if you're feeling shy. So where there's an everyone and a down arrow, you can just click on the down arrow and message me directly. Otherwise, thank you so much, everybody. It was lovely to have you in the room and lovely to be able to share some of these ideas with you. And I hope that we can find ways of working on these together.